Hey everyone, welcome to the We All Suffer podcast. I'm Cam Straw. So the series we are starting is about the desert and the desert theme in the scriptures, and not just a physical space like the dry, empty, desolate kind of place that we all think about, Wile E. Coyote and all that, or Good, Bad, and the Ugly, but also the spiritual, emotional, transitional spaces we find ourselves in sometimes, you know, those seasons of life where there's nothing that feels certain, or you're just out there waiting, wandering, figuring out who you are, who God really is. The desert theme shows up a lot of places in the scriptures right from the moment humanity leaves Eden, really, and it's not random. Like, the desert's where people wrestle, where they're tested, where God shows up in ways they couldn't have seen in the comfort of their own home or their familiar situation or circumstance. It's a disorienting thing and barren, but it's also where transformation happens. And so I hope you like this conversation with me and Courtney. We'll look at like what the desert means to us and our own experiences with it. And, you know, we're going to do a lot of episodes actually after this one. This is going to be like a 5 or 6 episode series. I'm not sure yet how it'll pan out, but we're going to talk about the Israelites, different people in the scriptures that we can learn from, Jesus in the desert as well. But today, we're just going to be talking about how this relates to us. And I think you'll see that it relates to you. Like, if you've ever gone through or going through some kind of transitional time in your life, or a season of loss, or feeling stuck, I think this wilderness imagery or desert imagery, however you want to say it, I think really speaks to all of our human experiences. And if you've ever wondered what it means for God to show up when you're in the middle of what feels like nowhere, you don't know where you're going, this is a good series for you. And, you know, we all go through desert moments in our life. You know, maybe you've lost a job, maybe you're leaving a relationship or community, or you're facing some unexpected uncertainty. And we find ourselves in these liminal spaces where the way forward isn't clear, but the wilderness has always been a place of provision, of learning to rely on something, someone bigger than ourselves. So, hope you enjoy it. Our new theme is going to be about the desert, and we are going to do 4 to 6 episodes depending on how adventurous we are. We kind of got to set the stage by talking about everything that happens before we, meaning humanity, starting with Adam and Eve, kind of get put into the wilderness, or anything east of Eden. I'm kind of thinking as wilderness. And so where to start? I mean, you know, I guess it's Genesis 3, right? It says, but in verse 13, in Genesis 3, verse 17, but to Adam he said, because you obeyed your wife and ate from the tree about which I commanded you, you must not eat from it. The ground is cursed because of you. In painful toil you will eat of it all the days of your life. It will produce thorns and thistles for you, but you will eat the grain of the field. By the sweat of your brow you will eat food until you return to the ground. For out of it you were taken, for you are dust, and to dust you will return. So there's a lot that I want to do with kind of this curse reversed kind of thing, because firstly, we aren't cursed. The ground is cursed. The snake is cursed, if you remember Genesis. But we have to endure suffering and pain and things like that after the garden, according to the Bible. And so it's really interesting because there
was no pain before that.
Right.
We're going back to the beginning,
right,
which was to look at, like, where does this even come from, essentially?
Right. Because the problem of pain is, like, if God's so good, why is there so much suffering? Or the problem of evil is the classic question, which is, if God is so good, or if there is a God, why is there suffering? And according to the Bible, this is where suffering starts and sin starts. And there's a lot of interesting imagery here about, you know, the wilderness, I guess, well, the curses and everything that, and suffering, and what that entails. And I guess the wilderness is something we're going to get into, and there's a theme, but it starts here. Because I think, even though it doesn't say it explicitly, I think everything when you leave the garden becomes this place of suffering and this place of scarcity. And I think that's what's being described with the thorns and thistles, and thorns and thistles choke and frustrate the growing process, right? And that's a whole theme. And he talks about, you're going to work, but it's not going to, the ground's not going to produce what it always should, and you're going to have to sweat. And I love Walter Brueggemann, but he says the curse on the ground and the expulsion eastward mark the first steps of humanity's journey away from God. The wilderness becomes both a consequence of sin and a stage for divine encounter. And the Jewish Midrash, it talks about, it says, when Adam was driven from the garden, the earth itself mourned, for it was cursed along with him. Yet God, in his mercy, planted seeds of redemption even in the curse. And another favorite, just to keep it going, C.S. Lewis, in the book The Problem of Pain, says, in Eden, humanity chose autonomy over trust, preferring their own wisdom to God's command. This choice inaugurated a life of suffering, meant not as mere punishment, but as discipline to restore dependence on God. And I think that's really interesting too, because that's like speaking to pride, and that's kind of like the absence of God, and even, Satan, and I guess the serpent that is later, we all see as Satan now, even though it never explicitly says it is, twists the truth. But his big sin, according to the scriptures, is pride and thinking he knows better than God. And then he gets us to think that.
Well, if we can go back really briefly to the scripture you read in Genesis 3,
Sure.
because I think that's so interesting that it says, in painful toil, you will eat of it all the days of your life. And it's so interesting to me that, God really never intended for there to be pain. And I think that's something that's so hard to remember, because at least I feel like I experience pain or suffering often in life as you grow up, but to recognize that was never God's original intention.
Right.
And it came about as Eve took the apple and such. But I just think that's a cool thought to land on, and how you're bringing up those other quotes from C.S. Lewis
totally.
and Bergman.
Well, no, exactly. And I think what you're saying is good, because it wasn't the original intention. Sin and all that complicated stuff, and that we chose, it's in our pride and all of that. It's like, it's complicated. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but that's where it starts.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot, even in exile, and there's themes of exile throughout the scriptures, but the exile mirrors the wilderness, and in a lot of ways. And so John D. Levinson, in his book The Love of God, said at a time, like the exile, he talks about the exile mirroring the wilderness, and he says a time of divine testing, but also of opportunity for covenant renewal. In both, God reminds Israel of their dependence on him and his faithfulness despite their rebellion. And that's the thing, is like, God still provides for them, even in the, like, even as soon, think about right when Adam and Eve sinned, like, he gave them skin, he put on clothes, he clothed them. And then there's this, even with Cain, I think when he got exiled after killing his brother, shortly after that, there's this like, hey, like, even though he had to he put a mark on him so nobody would kill him. And so
God still comes through.
Yeah.
In
there's
the
still
midst
this
of it.
protection and God's faithfulness. And so just to kind of go through, we're going to talk about all these different themes, so I don't want to talk about it too much. We're kind of giving an overarching in this episode of just what we're going to talk about in further episodes. In this episode, we're going to more share our story, but I do want to give an accounting of just why we're going over this motif in the scriptures of the wilderness or desert, because it is a common theme, and I want to prove that just by going through the list. But one more quick quote on that from Abraham Heschel, in his book, The Prophets, he says, even as humanity is cast into the wilderness, God's presence follows. The exile is not abandonment, but an invitation to seek him.
I love that.
And I think that's even with, you think about the Exodus story with the cloud and the fire, the cloud during the day, the pillar of cloud, and then the pillar of fire at night. So there's this guidance and this provision all throughout. But, just to go through the story. So the Adam and Eve obviously get exiled from the garden, banished from Eden, sent into the symbolic wilderness of the rest of the world. There's even the event of the Tower of Babel. Humanity's pride again leads to dispersion and further alienation, reinforcing this theme. But also, just to say, the Bible's dope. There's a lot of themes that are just, it's like, Tim Mackey, I think, described it as jazz. There's this underlying chords and everything, and then there's this people riffing on it, and it's the same story just expressed in new ways. And there's all these themes, but it's kind of the same story all throughout from creation on, and even up till Jesus, and we get into that in further episodes too. But so you have the Tower of Babel, and you have Cain, banished from God to wander the earth after killing Abel. We just talked about that. Abraham, he was living a cushy life with his fam. God tells him to go to a distant, travel to the desert areas, including this area called Mount Moriah for Isaac's sacrifice later. But he left kind of this comfortable life. And then Lot, after, I think that's Abraham's brother, right? Or cousin, I can't remember. I think his brother. But he fled into the wilderness after the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. You got Hagar. So she was driven in the wilderness, I think twice, one before having her son Ishmael and one after. So, and this is interesting. I wanted to note that's her story is the reverse of Israel's story, because here Hagar, an Egyptian servant, is oppressed and treated harshly by Sarah, who's Jewish, and then flees to the desert. And then later Israel's impressed by Egypt. They're oppressed by Egypt and flee to the desert. So it's kind of this mapping. So that just kind of shows you some of the mirroring and some of the cool transposing, if you will, of different stories that can lay right on top of each other. And not always exactly, but there's these common threads and themes all throughout. And it's pretty fascinating, amazing. I'm still just barely scratching the surface. But you guys are going to like the next episode, because we got a Messianic rabbi friend of mine that's joining, and he's going to go deep dive into things that I probably never thought about. So that's going to be cool. And so then we have Jacob, who Israel, becomes Israel.
Yep.
And he flees into the wilderness to escape Esau's wrath and had an encounter with God and all this stuff there. Joseph, kind of this, he gets sent to Egypt, but he also was in this pit, and that's kind of wilderness vibes. But he gets sent away from his place. And then Moses,
definitely,
which is really mirroring, he flees to Midian after killing an Egyptian, right? Stays there for 40 years. I think he killed the Egyptian when he was 40. And then he stays in, Midian for 40 years as a shepherd before returning to Egypt. Yeah. And then he led Israel through the desert for another 40 years, right? So that's pretty interesting. And then you have the Israelites, obviously, with that we just mentioned, but they're part of that story in the wilderness for 40 years. Samson even retreated to a cave in the wilderness. Elijah went to Mount Horeb, which is Mount Sinai, which is where Moses was and where Moses encountered God. And that's where God also appears to Elijah and the gentle whisper that happens on the same mountain, which is where Moses saw the burning bush. There's a lot of this interesting, and Mount Sinai happens to, Mount Horeb means desert, Sinai means thorn. So I also think there's this kind of reimagining. Yeah, because it's like a reversing.
Thorns and thistles.
Well, I think it's reversing the curse, right? And even the dust, right? We were created from dust, but then now we're going back to dust, and it's like, so what is this life-giving thing that we came from? Now we're going back to it. It's this a lot of cool curses being reversed and cool stuff happening, and God revealing himself even in the midst of those things. I think is part of that is what it means, but I'm sure it's even deeper than that. But just kind of going through it, there's different prophets. Jeremiah wasn't necessarily someone who was in the desert, but he talked about it a lot. But there's speculation he might have been in the desert. Ezekiel was in exile. Jesus gets called in the desert. John the Baptist.
Right.
And we're going to talk about Jesus in this whole other episode. There's Paul, who also spent time in Arabia. And so after his conversion to prepare for ministry, so he said for about 3 years. John, who wrote Revelation, has his revelation on Patmos, where he's exiled, I think. So that was kind of a wilderness experience, isolation. And then Revelation also talks about God's people as a woman fleeing into the wilderness. And anyways, there's a lot of desert going on is the point.
Yeah.
And so, but
I don't know. That's like
yeah,
at least 13 different examples.
there's a
at
lot.
least, right?
Yeah. There's a lot of examples in the
Maybe.
scripture, and that might not have even been all of them, right? There's way more scriptures. Like Isaiah is all about. It talks well, it isn't all about, but it talks about the desert a lot. Yeah. So I think the desert can represent like a lot of things, but ambiguity, scarcity, but also testing, temptation. I think it highlights our need to believe in something outside ourselves to provide, which is God. And I think it also brings up a lot when we have to, just slough everything off, cast off, everything. And I think, you don't have any distracting things. Like you can think about different idols, different things that we spend our time thinking about that isn't God. But there's also this theme in the desert that comes up, and something that comes up in the desert brings up, I guess, is identity, because of what the desert brings out. It tests us. It shows us who we are, and who we're meant to be, and who God is, and also helps us see who God really is, because that's also where God reveals himself, but it's also where ourselves are revealed. And so you have Moses, and you think about David becoming who he became before he really became king. And there's so many examples of that. And even the fact that where God reveals himself is Mount Sinai, and Sinai means thorn, Mount Horeb, which is Mount Sinai, it means desert. And so, I think that's a big piece.
Yeah. There's usually like a transformation that happens, that occurs when you go into the desert. But I also think of it, you might have said this, but what the desert feels like is really an emptiness or feeling barren. Like there's usually a sense of, you don't know where you're going, or you don't know how long you're going to have to be there. Like for Moses or Abraham or Jesus, there always seemed to be times where there was just emptiness. There wasn't anything that they had except for really a moment to choose faith and trust. And that's kind of cool.
Yeah, I mean, there's something about solitude. There's something about silence, the uncertainty, having to rely on God. There is a transformation that takes place because you're not forced to rely on God in it, but these people are called to go out, and it's a place that God does reveal himself, and I think that's really interesting. But yeah, we have one of these themes. I think one of the episodes we recorded that's going to be released on this series is about God making something out of nothing, making streams in the desert. It's even about creation. Like you think about, there was it was formless and void, and there was chaos and waters, and he made something out of nothing then, and talks about God bringing, there's just so many scriptures about God bringing something out of nothing in the whole Exodus story. So we're going to get into a lot of details about that, but there's this new life concept in the desert, and we find life there. And I guess the way we think about it, it's like, I think it's because like I was thinking about modern day living and celebrity culture and all that stuff, because right now you think about all these people in the 21st century, they have everything that seems like they need, all the money, clothes, house, cars, whatever, but then they like can't handle themselves, and they OD on drugs or something, and they get on all kinds of bad stuff, or go through like 20 different marriages, and they're never satisfied with anything that life has to offer. And I think the desert also symbolizes this kind of starkness, like there's barrenness, like we were talking about, and that's even a theme in scriptures with not only the desert, but also the barren woman, the barren womb, and then God redeeming that and helping those women in the Bible to rely on him. And then he gives them, a baby. And I think, because they have to rely on God. They can't produce something on their own. And then all of a sudden God shows up. So I think that's also part of this theme. And there's also something about patience and learning, because it's not just like, oh, I just want to go through the desert really quick and stop by and sightsee really quick. No, like it's not that.
Yeah. Hey, it's not our world of instant gratification or Amazon package the next day or even a couple hours later that just came.
Shut up while we're recording this. So no, well, it's funny because, a couple of years ago I went to Disneyland, which isn't my favorite thing, but there was this whole pay to get to the front of the line thing, right?
Oh, and fast track or something.
Yeah, and it's called something. I don't think it's called something like that. And I went to the Seattle Space Needle, not to go up it, but just I was around there the other day, and I saw that you can blast right to the top if you pay 3 times what you'd pay just to wait a little longer. Yeah, and I was just laughing to myself like,
oh
really?
Man.
People, I wonder how many people would pay that. But that's
true.
That's America right now.
Yeah.
That's the West. Like, it's just like, I want it now. And there's no concept of suffering or these trials or testing that we should go through, and that's necessary for us to go through in order to become who we really are.
That is so true, because I noticed that as a teacher, right, to my students, who all of them have laptops at our school, right? And we're a privileged school at the same time, so we probably have more resources than a lot of people. But the fact that we can search anything, get answers to anything right now. They can ask ChatGPT to write them an essay instantly, even though they're not supposed to. It still happens. Put it out for you. But the fact that that's so accessible to our psyche, right, into our lives, is so interesting, because the desert is patience. And I think for me too, but I see this in our culture, that's not attractive. Right. We don't, or comfortable. Maybe it's not part of our natural. Like, we've been trained to actually get things instantly.
They call the other word for patience in the Bible is long suffering. Right.
Oh yeah.
And I think that's that always stuck with me, because just the word itself. I'm going to start using that word in general. I feel like that phrase.
That's good.
I'm not sure if the word's Greek or Hebrew. I think it's Greek. You can check that for me. But yeah, the long suffering is not something we're used to. But I think it's because, it's, like we said, it's America. But I think what we experienced when we left our church and our community, we left all that in the Bay Area, and obviously you were born into it, grew up in it. I came into it in my late teens, early 20s. And we had to leave that, which was for a lot of reasons. And interestingly enough, there's a quote by Walter Brueggemann, talking about liminal spaces. And in the last episode with Ginny, actually she talks about this liminality, which means it's related to a transitional place in your life or initial stage or process. But Brueggemann, who's one of my favorites, in his book, The Land, Place as a Gift, Promise and Challenge in Biblical Faith, he writes, "The wilderness is a space of disorientation and reorientation, where Israel unlearns Egypt and learns covenant faithfulness. It is in this liminality that the people are transformed." And I think about that for us, because we have been through that. We've had to unlearn, relearn. There's this buzzword deconstruction now, but I think it's often misused. But it depends on how you're using it, because people can deconstruct down to the floorboards and they don't have anything left. But I think we've deconstructed, okay, what is church? Okay, what is the difference between what the Bible says church is and what church really is, and what does the Bible really say, and what is the context here, and because we've gotten told a lot of things, sadly, in church and through different leaders and people that weren't really in the Bible. And it wasn't really what the Bible was saying, or it was in the Bible, but it was taken out of context, and it was kind of a power trip thing, like Egypt, they had a tyrannical ruler, and it kind of felt like that's what we had. And, obviously we weren't in slavery, but it felt like something like that, like we had to leave this kind of tyranny of sorts and this kind of boxed spirituality and that we were a part of, and go away from that. And it was scary in a lot of ways, but was also really exciting because it's tested us. And here we are, I guess, a year and a half later, living here in Seattle, and it's definitely not the desert in terms of the way that Seattle looks. It's like rainy place, and there's a lot of trees and life in terms of the geography or the biome out here and the weather. But in terms of like our life point, I felt like that a lot, wouldn't you say?
Yeah. I agree. It's been, I would say we came from a place that was also very formulaic and had a process of relationship with God that was kind of like, here, fit in this mold, exactly, this cookie cutter, with the maybe illusion of like we're doing the right thing and all of this is good. And so it was easy for me as a person who is maybe more inclined to harmony with others. And I just did like a little personality thing recently. It's like, you want to be more harmonious with people. You are judgmental and a little more introverted. And so being someone that like wants to probably fit in more, it was actually an easy place to fit in, but realizing that didn't really facilitate an independent walk with God. And when you move, you have to really face the facts of who you are as a person. Like I had you, thankfully, but beyond that, there weren't a lot of relationships I had up here. And so we had to kind of like seek out. I feel like it was a desert. And I'd kind of find these, like, what is it called when a mirage is when you think you see something that isn't there.
But it's really not there.
Yeah, I think I saw some mirage of like, oh, that's the church I used to know, and that's really comfortable. Like talk about comfort and not wanting to like go deal with long suffering, which I looked up, and it is Greek. There it is. Yeah, but the idea that God was breaking us out of this like way of doing things that I had literally grown up in.
Mm-hmm. You're ingrained more than.
Oh my gosh!
Anything.
Yeah.
It's like a fish doesn't know the water. When
I grew up
swimming. It's like, what's water?
in it. Exactly. Yeah. That was all I knew, and grew up in it, served in it, led in it.
And that was more part of your identity as a result of that, right? Because it was like so much. So you had so much wrapped up in this church and this community, but it wasn't really necessarily what God made you to be or who God called you to be. And I think this, I've seen you and me, I think, but especially you, I feel like blossom more and more the last couple of years after leaving that, because it's almost, and that's where it comes to this like necessary thing about the desert, right? Where we kind of need it in order to become who we are meant to be. And in order to find God for who he really is, right? Because he reveals himself time after time in these desert places. And yeah, I just found that to be really interesting. The thing about identity, I didn't quote this, but Terence Frethrum said a couple of things, but he said the wilderness experience is pedagogical. It teaches Israel trust in divine provision and the cost of rebellion. It is a crucible for shaping identity as God's covenant people, because that's where obviously they become a nation and a people in the way that, you know, in that covenant relationship with God. And he also says the wilderness reveals God's immanence. The pillar of fire and cloud symbolize his continual guidance, while the manna and quail testify to his provision. But I think there's something about going through the fire. It's going through the, you know, the test, the hardship that we've had to experience. And I think you especially having to experience with, I'm sure we'll get into that in further episodes, more details, but I think like hardship and even like thinking come out here, we had new jobs we had to get. Like I lost my job like 2 weeks after moving here.
Oh
and,
yeah.
Like, we spent this money to move, and
oh my
we
gosh.
didn't necessarily, it took us a minute to find the church up here that we were really going to vibe with in the community. And we're still, you know, building friendships and not a new place. Everything's new. It's scary in a way. We're in our 30s, so it's like I don't know, building relationships in your 30s are different. It's not just like proximal or whatever, like where it's, oh yeah, we go to the same school or whatever. Mm-hmm. You can just like pick up and play basketball with a kid on the playground and make friends, you know, for the rest of your life. It's not really like that. And so it's definitely that liminal space. But I do feel like it is this transformative thing at the same time in that, because that's, I guess, how it has to happen.
Because you have to trust.
Yeah.
At least that's what I keep hearing, and what I hear from that quote too is that desert is a place in which you experience the opportunity to rely and trust on God. Yeah. And I feel like that has definitely been our move out here, because like you just said, we didn't have anything else. I try to think of an analogy that would relate, but I can't think of.
Well, I mean, it is in itself the analogy, right? Like, I think we moved out
it is
here.
a desert.
We didn't know anyone. We didn't know any neighbor. Like, I had to ask people, like, is this a safe neighborhood? Like, should this be a place we move? We didn't even know how things worked out here. There's different laws. There's different.
Right.
Know, people drive differently. People do things differently. Like we thought.
Thanks, Washington slow drivers.
Yeah. But they're also crazy too. But one of the things, like this neighborhood, like we got put in here, we didn't know anybody in the neighborhood, but now we have a church down the street that we're connected with. We have neighbors that we know just by walking around, and luckily Seattle is actually friendlier than the Bay. It's all relative, because there's something called the Seattle freeze we learned about when apparently people think Seattleites are really rude and cold, but compared to the Bay Area, they're a lot more friendly. Like, we have people like walking around, like walking out of their house like, hi,
yeah,
like neighbors are like, what? But if you come from the Midwest or something, I think people, you know, obviously feel like this is a lot different. But yeah, or in the winter especially, I think people can be a little like cold because it is cold outside and it's darker earlier and people just want to be left alone maybe. I don't know. But it's not that bad. In fact, we love it. And there's all this, you know, all these national parks.
But we didn't know all this when we came here. Yeah, that was the coolest thing and the scariest thing, because we really just in that moment felt like God was leading us to Seattle, and we didn't quite know why.
Right. Yeah. Well, he made it very clear. We won't tell that whole story here, but I think like there were a lot of answered prayers, a lot of signs, a lot of cool stuff. But I think about the growth and the trajectory he had us on, because it wasn't easy on our marriage. I mean, we'd had harder things that we'd gone through, I feel like, than this, but this was really challenging. And trusting each other and trusting God, trusting the process. I like that's the theme you're picking up, because I think that's what it is. We had to trust that the job that we were both going to get was going to be good.
Right.
And I didn't know that I was even going to get a job, and you didn't know if that was going to pay. And I was like this whole thing. And so,
Right.
but that's like relying, it's faith. It takes like, okay, we don't know. And that's the other thing is the Egypt thing. And we're going to get into this, I'm sure, more next episode when I talk to Matt. But it's like there's this, you see one of the themes in terms of Israelites going out of Egypt, they wanted to go back, and when you fit, and there's this like kind of like there's that where we want familiar, we want to the familiarity and the security we get in something like church, in terms of like the organization of it, the rules of it, the belief systems of a structural thing like that aren't always good, but they're familiar, and it gives us a sense of security, even though it's not real security. Real security comes from God, but God's security isn't always this thing that's like something that requires faith. It's not something that's just like, oh, I can hang my hat on these beliefs, and I can hang my hat on these comforts and feel good about myself. Like that. That's what certain churches can provide in a way that's not always healthy, because it confuses the person of God with this, person on stage, or this religious kind of practice that isn't always bad, but it can be something that becomes stale and can replace God for people, instead of being something that's more spirit filled and spirit led.
Right. Because I don't think that moving had to be our desert. I think we could have had a desert moment back where we were, but for whatever reason, and I can see a lot of good that has come from this particular direction God led us in, but that you could be in a place for a long time and go, this is a desert moment, and I have to question where God is leading me. Like, why are we in this moment in time? And it doesn't have, like, for us, it was the church community we were part of, having to like really face facts about my own relationship with God and like what he wanted from me above what I had comfortably viewed as what people wanted from me. But I think about that too, just even in my journey of like wanting to having kind of some health problems too, and thinking that like even those moments, like health can be a desert, and has been a desert for actually a couple legitimate years.
Well, it's suffering. It's something that
Exactly.
And it talks about like just like that quote I read with Terrence Frethream. I don't know how to say his last name, but he said it's pedagogical, which is it's teaching. It's a teaching moment, and I think that's what hardship is.
Right.
And moving. Why is moving one of the most stressful things? Like rated, when you look at the ratings, I don't know, the most stressful things. It's like moving's a big one. Well, I think there's a lot in that, not just the fact that you're putting things in boxes and moving into a place, but you're going somewhere new. There's a lot of stress in the liminal thing, and the wilderness kind of represents that. It's this in between. We're in between a place where we were settled, like physically, mentally, spiritually, relationally, to a place that is unsettling. We're unsettled, like even though we're now all our stuff's out of boxes, it's our stuff's not out of boxes in terms of like emotionally, spiritually. We're still figuring all that out and having to unpack, and that's, I don't know, really it's teaching, right? And just like health, you've had some breakthroughs. I've had some breakthroughs in the last year and a half, but that's been a journey too, and it's something that we're still learning consistently and constantly, having to understand who God is shaping us to be, but it's hard that that's kind of the way it has to happen, it seems like, because I'm like, I couldn't see you having the breakthroughs you've had we not had this experience. Well, yeah, not just like moved, but been in a new place and gone through.
Did the desert training God was doing. Yeah.
You do have to accept it.
You do. I think that's true. Like, yeah, that was actually interesting. When you were reading the different like examples, or going through the different examples of people in the desert. And when you were saying that, most of those people had to flee, like, they had to actually run from something they had to choose to go into the desert. And I think in some ways there was a few times where, Joseph, he was cast into the desert by his brothers. And, but I think like that's totally what is mimicked in our lives too, that we kind of have to like be open to the possibility that God is testing us in our suffering, and that suffering is maybe actually this like knocking on the door of, hey, I want to come close to you.
Yeah. And when it's in this kind of suffering specifically, right? Where, because it's not always, like I know you mentioned your health as a form of desert, but I don't know if that's necessarily desert as much as it is just suffering. But there's like, when I think about desert, I do think about, I guess it could be because it could be like the scarcity or the ambiguity, or that we don't know where it comes from.
Yeah, that like
you don't know where how long it's going to be or what's going to happen.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, that's why I think the desert relates to hardship, and it is hardship, and it is suffering. And yeah, there is this needing to acknowledge something that God's showing us, and look for it and pray about it and cry out for help in it, and need to rely on God. I mean, I think about the cool things that He's done in us and through us because of this. Like, even, now I'm getting to help out in different capacities, and we're in terms of campus ministry, and we're connected with different community, like the prayer house and stuff that we're a part of, and you leaning into more of the worship and prayer, but like how that just kind of happened because of relationships and God putting us into places. Like one of our neighbors is connected with that, and then someone else we knew was connected with it, and then someone else we knew,
and being just also desperate for some other ways to commune with God. Because I can feel like, oh, where are you, God, when I'm in this emptiness? And then just that He opened different relationships and like led us in different ways is definitely, I feel like I would not be, I think, more open to the ways God wants to connect through music or through writing, as I am now, because of those times that we've connected like in prayer on it with God, and feel like God's been leading us. So I just think that's really cool.
Yeah, I think that is really awesome. And I mean, I don't know if there's any, I just think about all the things, and I don't know, like all the specific examples and stuff from the last couple of years, but I just think about God providing as we've learned to trust Him, and we're still, on our journey. But I think we've also experienced like great friendships. We've experienced things that we've never would experience had we not leaned in and let Him lead us through the desert, and trust that this is where He's bringing us. And